Thank you very much to the Royal Society for supporting this lecture tour, and it's great to be in Wellington. And I'm looking forward to showing you a few things about plants that perhaps you didn't know. But let's first start off with the individual whose lecture series this is named after, Leonard Cockayne. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the history of New Zealand science, Leonard Cockayne is one of those great giants of our science system. He was one of the most famous, most eminent botanists in New Zealand, and he really developed the field of plant ecology. And his book, entitled The Vegetation of New Zealand, became a classic and was used in universities for over 70 years. So he really did make a major contribution to our science. But I'm not going to tell you anything about that. I'm going to tell you something else. I'm going to tell you something about the dark side of Leonard Cockayne, something that perhaps the Royal Society don't want you to hear. So if I get whisked off in a moment, that'll be because I'll be telling you some aspects of his interests that perhaps are contrary to perhaps the conservation view of his contributions to ecology. The first thing is he was very interested in plants, but in his garden towards New Brighton in Christchurch, he had an experimental garden where he planted, as you can see, over 2,000 non-native plant species, and he was an inveterate sharer of seeds between different botanic gardens, introducing things and growing them up. He loved the non-native species. And as a result, he's also the founding member of the Christchurch Beautifying Association. And as you might imagine, any of you who've been to Christchurch, there are not many native plant species planted there. It's very much a non-native flora. But probably more relevant to this talk is that he did not believe that non-native plants could actually colonize native habitats. And I think over the years we've shown that that is probably a mistake. And so part of this talk is to illustrate why our perception has changed over time, and indeed what the problems with these non-native plants are at the moment and might be in the future. So I guess the first thing I need to really make sure you're all on the same page is, what is a weed? Now I'm going to give you a few definitions. The first one is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. So that's what I'd class as the politically correct definition, in that it's the kind of thing you get on school reports these days where, you know, little Johnny doesn't really do much reading or writing, but just because he's not quite discovered his potential. So that's that definition. The next definition, which is probably more familiar to you, is that a weed is a plant in the wrong place. And this is what I call the gardener's definition. You know, I don't want that plant in my garden, but I don't mind digging it up and throwing it over the fence where my neighbour can get it. So that's the kind of, I don't want it on my doorstep. But the definition that I'm really adopting here is somewhat more evidence-based. And it's a plant that has a negative impact on either the environment, human health, or the economy. And so these are the species I'm going to be really talking about today. But before launching into all our non-native species, and non-native species are those species that have been brought here primarily since European colonization, we have native weeds. And here are some examples of native weeds. We have manuka, bracken, tutu, bidibid, poroporo, and mulumbeckia. Now, these, of course, are weeds in the sense of plants potentially in the wrong place. These were major weeds colonizing agricultural habitats earlier in the 1900s, and clearly they were not wanted species in the productive ecosystems. So there were clearly, these plants play an important role in the native ecosystems. They were not in the right place when it came to agriculture. And Leonard Cockayne did write a relatively lengthy article describing the power of these plants to actually colonize human-modified habitats. And this gave him the conviction that native plants could resist the invasion by non-native species. And just as an aside, I want to point out manuka, which until recently was really seen as a weed and dug up and burnt and taken out of agricultural land, is now, of course, a species whose potential has been discovered in terms of manuka honey. But that's the last I'll talk about native weeds. I really want to talk about the non-natives. So again, just three very simple definitions. The first one is what a casual is. A casual is a plant species found in the wild, but it doesn't persist. Often it's found near human habitation, but it doesn't persist. So after a cold frost or some other event, those populations will tend to decline. A naturalized non-native weed is one that can persist. It can maintain self-populations and can spread into the environment. And the third definition is invasive, and this is the same as we use in New Zealand, the pest plant definition. That is, a plant that causes negative impacts on human health, the economy, or native biodiversity. So I'm going to use those three definitions throughout this talk to illustrate some of the aspects as how we appreciate the threats posed by these plants and the opportunities for us to prevent some of these future threats from occurring. So let's go back to Leonard Cockayne. Here's a statement of his, which he rather robustly defends his opinion. He was the kind of person who did robustly defend his opinion on many issues. But here he's defending his opinion that non-native plants weren't a threat to our natural ecosystems. And I think the issue here is, it says, time after time since 1900 have New Zealand botanists shown this to be a mischievous fallacy. And my goal in life is to get mischievous fallacy in one of my papers when I'm responding to some other colleague's work, because I think it's a great term. So this was in 1932, quite a while ago, and you'd think that by now the evidence is built up to actually decide whether that is a true statement or not. And actually the evidence should actually be pointing to the fact that under these circumstances, Leonard Cockayne was probably incorrect, that non-native plants are entering our native habitats and threatening our native biodiversity. And I wouldn't need to be telling you this talk had that opinion become more widely accepted, but it hasn't. Here are some recent books stemming from all around Europe and North America that propose that actually non-native plants are an integral aspect of our natural environment that should be treasured, and that weeds in defense of nature's most unloved plants, or that in the face of huge climate change or environmental changes, non-native species are the savior rather than the threat to our environment. Now, you may be familiar with some of these books, and I have to admit this is the kind of response I'd like to write a mischievous fallacy to. I want to give in the rest of my talk some evidence as to why the authors here are probably misleading the reader in terms of their position on the value of non-native plants. So what are the reasons why we should be concerned about non-native plants in New Zealand? Well, let's go back in time a little bit to when Cockayne was living in New Zealand. He was born in the UK, but moved to New Zealand in 1881 and lived here till his death in 1934. So you can see here the period in which he lived. And here is a graph of the number of naturalised non-native plant species and the year. And you can see that from the records for the Hurst herbarium specimens, there has been a progressive increase in the number of non-native plants ever since 1825. During Cockayne's period, he thought there were about 650 non-native plants in New Zealand. But really the trend was fairly gradual, and he probably had no understanding that the dynamic of these introductions was changing over time. But an optimist in those days might have said, well, if things continue like this, we might expect that by the year 2000, we might have around 1,000 to 1,200 non-native plants. The reality is somewhat different. What we see is, particularly since 1940, there's been a rapid change in the number of non-native plants naturalising in New Zealand. And so our whole perception of what the threats might be have had a radical rethink since then, particularly since the days of Leonard Cockayne. And I want to try and explain to you what might have led to those things. And you can probably guess from the title of my talk where that problem arises from. So here's a graph looking again at about 300 islands that I was able to get data for in terms of their area and the number of naturalised plant species on those islands. And so here are about 300 islands, and I wanted to see where New Zealand would fit on that graph. Can anyone hazard a guess? Well, there you go. There's the North Island and there's the South Island. So coming from the South Island, it's a relief to know North Island is more infested than the South Island. But it's not much of a great satisfaction to see both the North Island and the South Island being at the top. The third point here, some people ask, is Tahiti. So we are probably the weediest islands in the world, which is not something we necessarily should be too proud about. And what does that mean? Well, in terms of impacts on the environment, the weeds that come into New Zealand, the non-native weeds, compete with native species. They can attract pollinators and to take them away from our native species, and they can hybridize with our native species, changing their genetics. In terms of economic effects, things like giant buttercup are toxic to cattle and can cause poisoning. Willows change the hydrology of our catchments, and other weeds just alter the productivity of our agricultural systems. And then there's a social impact. Aesthetics. Not many people love hillsides covered in gorse. I know that Wellington's got its fair populations of gorse, so has Canterbury. They're not necessarily that attractive as sites, and if you do think they're attractive, always encourage people to walk through them, and they'll see exactly how attractive they are. Flammability. We had some terrible fires a couple of years ago on the Port Hills, and what combusted was mostly non-native trees and shrubs. And allergies and skin irritations, such as this plant, giant hogweed, which can give you some very nasty ulcerating blisters. So, all in all, there's quite some nasties in our non-native flora that we should be really concerned about. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of impacts for our pest plants that we find in New Zealand, most records suggest that it's native plant diversity that they're diminishing. So these plants enter our forest habitats, our bush habitats, our coastal environments, and replace the native species that are there, so reducing that diversity. But water quality is another aspect which is becoming increasingly important in New Zealand, and then they change things such as animal health and human health, fire frequency, and hybridisation. And I'll talk a bit more about hybridisation because that was a favourite topic of Leonard Cockayne. He wrote a number of monographs exploring hybridisation amongst native species. Now, what about the economic cost? Let's look at these costs for a suite of different non-native weeds in New Zealand. You can see one single species, Californian thistle, every year costs $704 million in terms of lost production or management. That's a huge sum. And so you can look, wilding pines are here at only 11. But look at these. These are mainly problem parts of agriculture. Some of these down here are much more to do with natural environments, but nevertheless, it's a huge impact. In fact, the current estimate of the kinds of impact this is causing is over $1 billion a year, either in lost production or costs of management to deal with these weeds. Imagine if we didn't have to do that, what that billion could actually be spent on. I mentioned hybridisation. Now, one of the things that always puzzles me is that we're adamant to maintain New Zealand GM-free. We don't want genetic modification altering our native ecosystems by genes spreading into those. But we seem to be very quiet on the fact that this is already happening, in that many non-native species hybridize with our native ones. So here's some examples. The South African ice plant hybridizes with our native Maori ice plant. The Australian Nio, or Bubiala, hybridizes with our native Nio. And Japanese knotweed will hybridize with Molenbeekia. Now, there are two concerns here. Is that, one, they create a new species that might have traits that make them far more impactful on our natural environment. So that's one. So the new species that emerges could have traits of both these species and be much more aggressive. The other aspect is that, of course, these genes are entering the native populations. And we have no idea what the long-term consequence will this be to the genetic integrity of our native populations. It's an area that's very relatively understudied, and certainly one that requires more attention. Then there are indirect impacts. And this is not an impact of the weed itself, but an impact through the weed, and particularly by being a host of pests and diseases. So hawthorn is a host of fire blight, which reduces our apple production. Boxthorn is a host of a very small insect, the tomato potato psyllid, which has become a big problem in potato agriculture in New Zealand, and creates something when you fry chips, this is what you get, something called zebra chip. And those chips are no longer marketable. And this has a major impact on the sustainability of some of our management of potato crops in New Zealand. And then we have tree lupin on the braided river systems of New Zealand that provide cover for predators that feed on nesting waders that are, many of them, endemic. So just those indirect impacts are something that are very hard to assess and quantify, and particularly hard to value. further impact is an aesthetic one. And these slides, just take your time to look at the three slides on either side. They're very similar. Now, as you can see, you probably can't see too clearly, but these are pictures taken from Chile, and these are New Zealand. And what we're seeing around the world is a suite of plant species being moved around through ornamental agriculture or forestry that are creating increasingly similar landscapes, what we call homogenized landscapes. So here we have lupins in Torres del Paine National Park, pines colonizing Patagonia, and Californian poppy around Santiago. And here we have the same, Californian poppy on the braided rivers of New Zealand, the conifers in Molesworth, and here we have lupins in Mount Cook National Park. So we increasingly see our landscapes are becoming very similar. And no one wants to spend a lot of money going to Chile to see lupins and wilding pines. You can spend a lot less money and go to the Mackenzie Basin and see all of that. So, there are some real challenges in a global scale in terms of how humans are moving a subset of species around the world, which are changing our ecosystems and making them more similar. Just to give you an idea of the scale of invasions, this is broom in Molesworth. You can see a nice patch of broom here. The Clarence River is up here, but it's a big invasion. These aren't just small patches, they're big. And similarly, here we have wilding pines on Lake Pukaki, again in Canterbury. Here is Tekapo B power station, to give you an idea, the hydropower station, to give you an idea of the scale of the invasion. This is the shelter belt from which the trees have spread, and over a very large area. So not only are these species causing environmental, economic and social problems, they're doing them on a very large spatial scale. And the third dimension is time. And to give you an example of how quickly these phenomena occur, I'm going to show you some pictures of a wilding pine invasion. So here is, again, in the Mackenzie country, a shelter belt with a few wilding pines having spread in 2006. This is about 1 kilometre from the top of the photograph to the bottom. So just look at this picture. By 2010, so 4 years later, that's what it looks like. So that's only in 4 years. And then 6 years later, 6 years later, it looks like that. So this is incredible spread and consolidation of an area. Now what you can see here is the red colour. This is aerial spraying of herbicide to kill the pines. And it leaves the pines dying. But just imagine if they'd done it there, what they could have saved. So part of my science here is really to identify when preventative action, the stitch in time saved 9, can be applied to prevent these kind of situations really spiralling out of control and increasing the costs of any kind of management. So another graph, this time again for these islands again, and you probably guess where New Zealand is on this graph. This is the number of native plant species we have in the country, on these islands. And again, the same axis here, the number of naturalized plant species. So again, where is New Zealand? Up here. So given our flora, we have the highest proportion of non-native plants than anywhere else in the world. So that's again not a very nice kind of consequence of some of our introductions. Now, why is that? Why is New Zealand so favoured by non-native plant species? Some might say, we all love New Zealand, it's a wonderful place to live, and maybe plants feel exactly the same way. They like coming here. Once they're here, they feel really welcome, they establish and they spread. Is that the case? Well, we've actually looked at plants in both their native range and in New Zealand to test that, the wonders of New Zealand effect. And we did it for Australian acacias, because everyone knows Australia is a tough place to live. So we'd expect species to do potentially better if they're weedy in New Zealand. So here's Acacia delbata, the silver wattle, and this is the seed production in New Zealand and in Australia. And this is a log scale. So what are we seeing? For silver wattle, the plant is producing 1 million times, and that's 1 million times more seeds in New Zealand than it does in its native Australia. Its productivity is vastly greater. The Cootamundra wattle doesn't seem to do much. So this is a major weed growing along river systems. The Cootamundra wattle is not a weed, and you can see that potentially that's why. And this species, Ovens wattle, is still being sold in New Zealand gardens, only started to appear as a naturalized plant in the last 20 years. And this is a species, I think, that is potentially a future invader, what I would call a sleeper weed, one that, if we don't start taking action soon, might become rather similar to the silver wattle in terms of its ability to spread across New Zealand and cause problems. So again, high production. New Zealand does seem to favour some plants compared to their native range. But there are other factors. So let's look at the data for New Zealand and Australia. We just want to compare these two regions. You can see New Zealand, 48% of its flora is composed of non-native plant species. So we have about 1,900 natives, 1,700, almost 1,800 non-natives. Australia has a much larger native flora. It's got actually quite a few more non-native species, but in a proportion, it's about 15%. So looking at that, one would say that this country is obviously more resilient, perhaps, to invasion than our own. But this changes when you look at the number of plants that have actually been introduced. In both countries, actually, similar numbers, slightly more plant species have been introduced in New Zealand than in Australia. And when you factor that into the count, when you think about the success of every plant introduced, in fact, New Zealand, for every plant introduced, there's a 6% chance that it'll naturalise. In Australia, it's an 11%. So it's not so much that our landscape is particularly suitable for these weeds. Indeed, some of them do benefit here. It's the fact is that for our small country, we have introduced just so many plants. It's a pressure issue. It's the fact that we're such inveterate gardeners that we have brought in a lot of material, more so in proportion than Australia. So it's really what I'd call introduction effort that is leading to some of these patterns, the fact that we're just very keen gardeners. There's another issue in terms of what we introduce. Wilding pines are a big problem, particularly in the South Island, but increasingly in the North Island. And if we look at pines as a global group, and we look at how problematic those pines are, we find that across the world, the global pool of around 112 pines, approximately a third we'd class as high risk. So they're likely to become invasive. Two-thirds are not risky at all. So what did we do? Which group did we like to introduce more? Well, actually, we introduced 52 species. Disproportionately, we introduced more of the high-risk species for forestry. Then, once we knew how well they grew, which ones do you think we wanted to plant? Well, actually, the area planted is we mostly planted the high-risk species. And not surprisingly, the established species are all the high-risk species. So there's a bias. Not only are we introducing more plants, but often we're biasing them in terms of their ability to become problematic. Now, there's a nice story here for Leonard Cockayne. Leonard Cockayne was in the 1913 Royal Commission on Forestry, and he decided, the committee decided that the future for New Zealand was exotic forests. And they decided that this would be how our forest system would grow. And the species he most favoured was Pinus radiata. And his idea was that this species would be an outstanding for growing on sand dunes to stop them blowing about and contaminating the land. So Leonard Cockayne had some very good ideas regarding ecology, but some of his ideas regarding non-native species, I'm afraid to say, were probably somewhat mistaken. So, having talked a bit more about the general issues of weeds and non-native plants in New Zealand, I want to focus on the ornamental area, which is an area which I've got particular interest, but hopefully I'll show is an important one for us to keep an attention of. I'm sure many of you are gardeners, and so therefore hopefully this hits home a little bit more than these abstract things of wilding pines. So here we have this graph again. This is the original historical figure, and I've got two groups here. Ornamental plants, those used in garden or amenity or landscape, and those non-ornamental ones, they're used in agriculture, or we don't know why they came in. They may have been brought in accidentally. What we see, remember the jump in 1940? It's nothing to do with the non-ornamentals. It's a jump in our ornamentals coming out. So what we've seen since 1940 is the weeds have increased, but they're different. They're not so much the weeds of non-utilitarian species, so things for agriculture or use or no known use. They are actually the species that we have planted in our gardens, are the ornamentals. So we've seen a phase shift in terms of the weed risks we're facing, from one which was mostly agricultural weeds to one where most of our plants that are coming in are ornamentals. And as you can see now, today, almost half of the non-native plants in New Zealand have originated from ornamental plantings in gardens. And to give you an idea of the families involved, the daisy family, the roses, mint family, grasses, lilies, and irises, these together account for about a third of all the non-native plants ornamental plants in New Zealand. So these 6 families have a disproportionate effect in terms of what we're finding in the wild in New Zealand. So why is that? What is it about members of the daisy family, or lilies for that matter, or irises, that make them so successful at naturalizing? Now, scientists like myself spend a lot of time trying to find the special traits that make a plant more or less problematic. And so you could go and think, well, roses, a lot of those are dispersed by birds, maybe that's the reason. Members of the daisy family, they've got those wonderful little pappuses, those feathery seeds, maybe that's one of the reasons they get dispersed so widely. But what's the reason? Well, here, this is for each one of these points is a plant family. This just shows the number of species introduced in a plant family and the number of species that naturalize. And all it simply shows is that the reason some families are up here and others are down here has relatively little to do with the biology. It has more to do with gardening fashion. So it simply shows that the more species you introduce in gardens of any particular family, the more likely they're going to naturalize. So the reason we have members of the daisy family or the rose family is nothing too much to do with their biology, but simply the fact that we as gardeners really appreciate those plants in our gardens. Now there is some variation here, so the number introduced is not the only determinant, but it does explain most of the variation. So again, it just sends the message that the problem is very much in terms of what we've been doing, the intensity with which we've been doing ornamental gardening in New Zealand. Now, the other aspect is that these plants are different to the weeds we've had historically. If you look here, this is the relative proportion of annuals, aquatics, perennials, vines, shrubs and trees. Now and you've got the non-ornamental plants, so those that were brought in for agriculture or brought in accidentally, and the ornamentals. Now if they're more or less the same, we'd expect a line going along here dividing the blues and the reds. But what you can see for aquatics, for vines and for shrubs, we have many more ornamentals than we have these non-ornamental species. So we've biased the weed flora towards certain plant groups, particularly aquatics, vines and shrubs. And when we see which plants are pest plants in New Zealand, lo and behold, it's things like shrubs are particularly high, perennials, and to a certain extent trees. But look at these, shrubs and vines are particularly high in terms of the relative representation in terms of their potential impact. So again, we've biased things a little bit towards species that are potentially problematic. And in fact, if we look at the pest plants, the invasive non-native weeds of New Zealand, they're disproportionately represented by ornamental species. 58% of all our pest plants stem from ornamentals as opposed to non-ornamental species. So what I wanted to figure out is, what is it about our approach to ornamental agriculture, ornamental gardening? And what I looked at was a database by the Royal Horticultural Society, which has a database of the Award of Garden Merit. These are the best plants that you can buy. And I compared it to a list of the worst plants you can buy, which are the Global Compendium of Weeds. So what did I find? Now, this is a line of 50-50. So this is the percentage of these AGM plants to be invasive. Now look at this. Almost, apart from cacti, almost all of them are more likely to be invasive than not. Look at these, bamboos, ferns, particularly bamboos, ferns and vines are just the plants that get AGM classification. Almost, it's like a synonym for plant me and I'll spread. And then I looked at, then I wanted to see, well, does that correlate at all with how appreciated these plants are? Now, I couldn't go to everybody's gardens here and find out which plants you got in your gardens, but I did look at a global database of botanic gardens and saw what plants were planted in botanic gardens around the world. And again, AGM plants, the invasive ones, tend to be planted far more frequently than those that are not invasive. So again, there's this pattern. Not only are these plants problematic, but we seem to like them more than other plants. And so we encourage their dissemination and spread because of our preferences for those species. So why is that? Well, let's look at the characteristics of awards of garden merit. They're going to be outstanding excellence for ordinary garden use. That means, Phil, you can grow it. You really aren't very technically competent gardener, but this plant won't die if you try and plant it. So that's always a positive for me. So good constitution, not requiring specialist growing conditions, i.e. it can grow almost everywhere. Not particularly susceptible to pests and diseases, so that gives it a head start compared to our native species, and available widely in horticulture, so you can get it down at Bunnings if you need it, or at Mitre 10 even. So the challenge here for managing this problem is that these issues go together. Popularity and problem species tend to be linked together by the way we choose plants and the way those plants spread into the natural environment. Just to give you some examples, Darwin's barberry, Kahili ginger, blue passion flower, African club moss, all major problem species in New Zealand, all gain the certificate of Award of Garden Merit. So there's the problem. Scientists are very good at standing up and saying, well, there's the problem, go figure. Now, that's not really the way we approach things at the Bioprotection Research Centre. We try and think a bit more about how that information, that evidence base, can be used to potentially do things a bit better. So now I want to think about how industry, government and the public are responding to this risk. So here's a little flow diagram that just illustrates the supply chain for ornamental plants in the world. So they come in from imports, they often go to wholesale suppliers, and then they go out to other organised landscape industry, independent retail, and the landscape industry can then distribute these to city councils, to local governments, to highway authorities, etc. But in general, these groups now in New Zealand are planting natives. So the main route that these problem plants come through is through to the general public. So either through wholesale suppliers, independent retail, or multiple retail, and they end up here. And there are a number of ways we might be able to influence the flow of plants. One is by managing things at the border. Then there's managing things after the border. And then voluntary codes of conduct for industry. And then finally, consumer awareness, so your awareness. So let's look at the pre-border approach. Now, New Zealand has a reputation for being one of the toughest countries in the world for bringing in new plant material. And rightly so, we've got a lot to protect. And we have a list called the Plant Biosecurity Index that has a list of thousands of plant species known to already be in New Zealand. And if they're on that list, and if they're in that list, you make a decision. So if you want to bring a plant in, is it on the list? Yes or no? If it's yes, you then check to see if it's prohibited. So some of the plants on that list are known to be problem species. We don't want more of them to come in. So if it's yes, you can't import it. If it's no, you can import it as long as you've got an import health certificate. And that's dealt with by the Ministry of Primary Industries. Now, if the species isn't on that list, you have to undertake a risk assessment. It takes up to a month, and it costs over about $17,000. And they're revising that figure to probably upwards. So imagine you're a horticulturalist. You want to bring in a new species. You think, okay, I think I could make a lot of money out of this species. What I'm going to do, I'm going to spend the $17,000 and I'll bring in this species. So you spend the $17,000, you get the plant approved, then everybody can sell it. You have no kind of license on that species. So it's a major disincentive for horticulture industry to bring in new species. And that's possibly why they're fairly resistant to losing species from their sales lists, their catalogues. So really, under these circumstances, bringing plants in can cause quite a few problems. And some of these problems are that horticulturists are forced to smuggle plants into the country. Now, maybe it's just me, but I tend to pick up on news when it's about yet another person trying to smuggle plants into underpants. It seems to be a favourite topic for the New Zealand Herald and the Christchurch Press, but it seems to happen quite regularly. As yet, no one has used this to introduce cacti. But there's always a first time, I'm sure. The other aspect is that even if you've brought the plant in and you're growing in a gardens, MPI can come and knock on your door and remove the plant and even take you to court over it. So New Zealand's got a very stringent border approach, and it can backfire. It can alienate the industry with whom we want to work with. Now, industry has been working both with DOC and the Ministry of Primary Industries and regional councils to design a list of species that they could ban from sale. It's called the National Plant Pest Accord. It was established in 2007, And it's now listed about 140 plant species that you can't purchase or propagate in New Zealand. So it's a world first, really, in the scale of the working relationship between the industry and the regulators. The problem is some of those plants that they've listed are already very widespread, like boneseed or Darwin's barberry. It's unlikely that banning from sale will have any real impact on the way those species are going to spread. Now, they have banned species that are relatively localized, but quite a few of the species are already, it's really the horse is bolted, and they're trying to shut the stable door after that fact. So for some of these species, the plant pest accord may not necessarily be an effective tool. For others it is, but at the moment, some species are not really going to be well managed by the plant pest accord. So if we look at this, then what we find is that actually species that aren't banned of pest plants in New Zealand, the majority of pest plants in New Zealand are not banned from sale. About 29% are banned. There's a huge number that aren't banned. So why don't we just ban them all? Well, we could, but the problem is industry is fairly resistant to this. It doesn't want to lose all this stock from its catalogues, because otherwise, what's it going to sell to the public? And if we look at Australia and New Zealand, since 1990, New Zealand has only approved fewer than 100 low-risk species for import. And that's because industry pays. Whereas in Australia, they've approved 1,500 low-risk species for import because the government pays. So the horticulture industry in Australia is very much supported by the government, who subsidises the risk assessment process. Here in New Zealand, it's a user-pay system. And that, I think, is problematic in terms of managing this problem. Industry will go so far, but it won't go as far as we might want, given the situation. And my feeling is there should be a quid pro quo here. Maybe government could support or subsidise risk assessment on the proviso that more species were taken off the sale list. There could be a situation there where both parties benefit. Then voluntary codes of practice are very widespread, particularly in the horticultural industry, which tell us to dispose of plants carefully, make sure they're well labelled, don't stock non-native species, etc. Now, it's very hard to get a feeling for how well voluntary codes of practice are the uptake of voluntary codes of practice. But you can get a feel for this by looking at botanic gardens. I'm a bit of a persona non grata with botanic gardens because I've published a number of things saying they're very naughty. But here's an example of their naughtiness. Anyone thinks of botanic gardens, and maybe somebody here from Botanic Garden here, I apologise, but people think of botanic gardens as major conservation repositories. But when it comes to invasions, they're not doing a particularly good job. So I looked at their policies on invasions. And I looked at 846 botanic gardens. And here are the policies. How many botanic gardens have a policy to prevent invasions? Across the world, less than 10% do. How many of them actually monitor the problem? Again, across the world, less than 15% of them do. And then some of them do research on the species, but then again, that's not a huge number. So basically, but if botanic gardens aren't really adopting voluntary code of practice that they have designed for their own industry or their own institutions, can we really expect industry or even consumers to do the same? I'm not sure. So finally, we come to consumers. Now, Plant Me Instead is a widespread system for providing alternatives to planting nasty non-native plants. Could I just have a show of hands as to who's heard of the Plant Me Instead program? Ooh, compared to other places. Oh, keep your hands up. Now, how many have actually used it? That's actually Wellington, you win the prize there. You're obviously far more switched on than Palmerston North, but you knew that anyway. But generally, the issue is that most gardeners aren't that familiar with it, and even if they are familiar with it, it's hard to actually apply that technique. So encouraging alternatives is often a real challenge. You don't tend to go to the nursery carrying Plant Me Instead in the back pocket. You need to have some form of notification when you're buying plants, some advice that suggests that perhaps you shouldn't buy that plant. But then there's public perceptions. No matter what we do, some people will just love non-native plants. And here we have lupins in the Mackenzie Basin, which people are queuing up to have pictures taken, their wedding photographs taken here. And people really do appreciate the beauty of these plants without understanding the underlying biology. So there'll always be a proportion of people that, no matter how much information you provide, will still appreciate non-native plants for other attributes rather than their biodiversity impacts. So what we suggest is that we should probably establish a better system with industry so that we work better in terms of removing plants from sale, if it means that then they can import species that are low risk and government pays for that screening. We could also work with industry to have a traffic light system when you go to plants. You don't need your Plant Me Instead booklet. You can get given the choice. Do you buy a plant with a red sticker that says potentially invasive or a green sticker that says environmentally safe, and let consumers make those decisions. That kind of system might work, and I think that's something that we should consider trying to develop in the future here in New Zealand. So in my last section of my talk, I want to talk about future weeds. And the great thing is about being a scientist telling you about future system problems is that, well, you will never know whether it's going to be true or not. And most predictions will occur long after I'm dead and gone. So it's a very safe ground to be in terms of predicting the future. But I hope that in this case I'll look at a more near-term scenario that might actually be implemented within the next few years. So where do weeds come from? Well, they're likely to come offshore. They can be cultivated species that we bring in, and that's deliberate imports. We know that route is pretty tough. They could be coming from cultivated species already in New Zealand, so they could just be new species that are in gardens that are jumping over the garden fence, and these we call garden escapes. Or they could be species that are currently naturalized that become, actually no, there's this one, which is accidental introductions, which are fairly minor. Or they could be species that are currently naturalized that become pest plants for some reason. And these I'm calling sleeper weeds. And I'm going to focus my talk, last bit of my talk, on garden escapes and sleeper weeds. So here in New Zealand, we have approximately 1,000 naturalized ornamentals. We have about 400 casual ornamentals, but we have about 25,000 ornamentals in our gardens. And we have very little idea of the risk that those plants pose. And to my mind, it's that we're just dealing with the tip of the iceberg. Remember, a lot of these ornamentals were brought in the post-war period. They haven't been here that long, and they probably haven't been planted that widely. So, how many AGM plants are you growing in your garden that are potentially invasive? So I suspect there is what we'd call an invasion debt in New Zealand, this below the waterline iceberg picture of potential risk. But how do we go about dealing with this? Well, one way, scientists have developed something called the weed risk assessment system. So you use a number of characteristics for plants, and you can screen out the good from the bad. The higher the score, the worse the plant. The lower the score, the better the plant. Here's some pine trees. So here the green ones are good. They're going to be acceptable. The red ones you shouldn't bring in, although we have. And then you've got some intermediate group that requires further evaluation. So you could do this for all 25,000 of those plants. The problem is to do this thoroughly takes one person about 2 days. So that's over 100 man-years to do that. Now, you could spread it out, but it's probably not a very effective way. So in the Bioprotection Research Centre, we're looking at artificial intelligence methods to try and speed this process up, to actually screen large numbers of species as opposed to do this in a painstaking way. But how do we assess shifts in gardening? Now, you may not be familiar with this, but gardening trends are changing quite dramatically. As climate warms, water becomes more of a valuable commodity. People are shifting to roof gardens, wall gardens, containerized gardens, a much greater emphasis on cacti and succulents, etc. So that's again shifting things towards plants that perhaps New Zealand hasn't been exposed to as much as it has been in the past, but also the New Zealand environment is becoming increasingly susceptible to those types of species. So trying to figure out how horticultural fashion is changing is a particularly important way to predict the future weeds. And casual plants, these plants that don't persist. In fact, most of the casuals in New Zealand are actually, here we can see the casuals are about 28% of our ornamental plants are casuals compared to non-ornamentals. So there's a big pool of species just hanging on in there. They're not naturalized, but they're just there, just jumping over the garden fence. There may be switches in the environment that lead those species to become weeds in the future, one of which could be climate change. And a lot of these species are frost sensitive, so as frost levels drop, we may see these plants become increasingly more widespread. And here's some examples of a number of plant species that are, you can tell, are likely to be limited by climate. Either they're stuck up in the northern parts, or they have clear boundaries which often relate to frost-free days, or they're species that mostly occur on the coast. And all three species here are likely to respond very well to climate change. And so, why don't we just knock these out now, as opposed to waiting till they become like this and we wave our hands and go, well, we missed that one. The other issue is that you might think we should have already had all the problem plants by now, but that's not the case. For many weeds, what we have is that since they jump the garden fence, they can take a very long time before they start spreading wider. This is Scotch thistle, it's not an ornamental, but you can see it took maybe 40 to 50 years of very slow population growth. This is herbarium specimens in New Zealand before it shot up. Well, we looked at these patterns for about 300 species in New Zealand, and we got this kind of graph that just showed that the average of this lag phase is about 40 years. So there's some species have had lag phases of close to 100 years, whereas others are much more rapid. What this is telling us is that there are still a lot of species introduced not that long ago in our gardens that have the potential to jump out of this lag phase and become problem species. So understanding this whole process of lag phases and what drives it is an area where we're looking at it at Lincoln. And if we can understand that, we may be able to predict which species are in their lag phase and likely to jump up to those that aren't going to do anything. Now this slide's a bit more complicated. This is the number of New Zealand regions where a species is naturalised, and we've got non-ornamental and ornamental. Look at the ornamentals. Many of the ornamentals are naturalised in only 1 or 2 regions of New Zealand. They're not widespread. There are quite a few widespread ones, but not so much as the non-ornamentals. So these species are everywhere, things like gorse, I suppose, or some of the brown top, some of the grasses. But these species are only localised, and that has a problem. That means that regional councils tend to be dealing with very idiosyncratic problems, so there's no coordination across the country, but it also means that these plants have the potential to spread. Now, what's the likelihood of species spreading? Well, non-native weeds can spread anywhere between 3 kilometres per year, but some as fast as 10 kilometres a year. So even though they might be in one region today, in a few decades they'll be in more than one region. And the reason is people dump them, they spread through dispersal, people still deliberately sow lupins in the Mackenzie country, river gravel transports for building works, they spread on vehicles, and they also move along transport corridors very rapidly because of the wind that trains and cars create. So these species are rapid dispersers, and so we can expect them to come to a location near you very soon. The other thing is, if you look at the number of New Zealand regions which the species occupy, there's a very good relationship between how long the species has been in New Zealand and how many regions it's occupied. So species that have been introduced in the early 19th century are very widespread. Those introduced in the latter half of the 19th century, 20th century, are very rare. What happens is it's just a matter of time. The longer plants are here, the more progressively they will spread. So we have, again, a lot of plant species introduced at these periods, and their potential to spread much more widely is quite clear. So again, the opportunity is here. Rather than targeting very widespread weeds, we have the opportunity to identify these very localized weeds in 1 or 2 regional councils that we could target rapidly. Now, the final slide I want to show you is one about the future and population growth in New Zealand. This graph shows human population size in the year 2000, where this was when I had the records for the naturalized plant species and the number of naturalized plant species. So this curve for the ornamentals, the very similar curves for ornamentals and non-ornamentals. We have Auckland up here, we have Wellington is here, and we have some of the other regions down here. Westland and Southland are down here. Now, if we project future population growth, we know that Auckland is going to be the major centre for human population growth. It might reach 2 million by 2043. But 2 million moves it across along here somewhere. So because this is a kind of declining relationship, the change potentially in the risk for invasions is much less for a large city getting bigger than it is for a small city increasing in size. These areas might change a great deal, but all projections suggest that actually those regions, Southland and Westland, are going to face declining populations. So perhaps population drivers aren't here. But my idea is that it's in these areas, the regions and also the smaller city areas that are likely to show good growth up to 2043, where human population pressure, new subdivisions, new construction will open the opportunity for new weeds being brought in. So, Wellington, pay attention. I think your population growth will come with a warning of invasions. So just to finish off, ornamentals are a major source of pest plants in New Zealand, and it's really down to our love of gardens, the widespread planting that facilitates their spread, and the association between the ease of cultivation and invasions. We need to better manage sales bans, and I think there needs to be some new thinking in this space to work with industry to improve the opportunities to get rid of species from our sales lists. We need better tools to assess the plants currently in gardens and also take those off any lists, and mobilise management early against sleeper weeds. We're just not doing that. And finally, if you talk to the regional councils, they're all very busy working on their own problems, but we really need to manage these plants at a national scale. So I think that the future, if we don't act now, is not particularly pleasant for weeds in New Zealand in terms of what we're going to face. And I think that the solutions are possible. And I hope that through my talk and the research that our teams and other teams in New Zealand are doing, we'll actually begin to get a better handle and hopefully reverse this kind of trend of increasing invasions in New Zealand in the future. Thank you very much.